We're going to start in a minute or two max. Thank you. All right, I guess we can start. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Kareem Estefan, the 2021 Dara الفنون Fellow, who's going to talk to us about his research titled Witnessing as World Building in Palestinian Visual Culture. Kareem Estefan is a writer, editor, and a PhD candidate in modern culture and media at Brown University. And he's completing a dissertation on witnessing and world building in contemporary Palestinian visual culture. Kareem's writing has appeared in publications including 4 columns, Art in America, Art Forum, Bomb, Freeze, Ibraz, Journal of Palestine Studies, Journal of Visual Culture, and many others. Kareem is also the co-editor of Assuming Boycott, Resistance, Agency, and Cultural Production, published by Orb Books in 2017, which is an anthology of essays on boycott campaigns, transnational solidarities, and self-censorship in the arts. He's the recipient of a 2021 and 2022 Mellon SELS Dissertation Fellowship, and also the co-chair of the Middle East Caucus of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. Kareem holds an MFA in Art Criticism and Writing from SVA, and a BA in Comparative Literature from New York University. Kareem and I will be in conversation following his presentation, and I also hope that you, our audience, will partake in this by sending in your questions through the Q&A window on Zoom. Welcome, Kareem, and you can take it over from here.
Thank you, Yazan. And I didn't realize I was sharing screen this whole time, so I guess you got a preview. Thank you all for being here. And I want to begin really by thanking the team at Dara الفنون, which has given me the opportunity to develop my research in collaboration with the programming at Dara over the last year or so. Including, interacting with the community, the artists who took part in the Summer Academy, where I led a couple workshops, and many who have attended Dara talks, including those that I curated as part of the series Worldbuilding in the Wake. This fellowship didn't begin as it was meant to. In the early months of 2020, I was living in Beirut, and I thought I'd soon travel to Amman to spend 6 or 9 months there at Dara الفنون, doing dissertation research in the library and working as part of a community of resident artists. And then, of course, came the pandemic, also the deepening economic crisis and the port explosion in Beirut, which pushed me to return to the US. So I'm speaking from Los Angeles now. I unexpectedly, though, had a virtual fellowship with the flexibility and generosity of Darat's team, and I was able to use this opportunity to curate a series of talks and still benefit from Darat resources at a distance as much as I would like to be in the library now. Today I'm going to first begin with some images from Bاسل Abbas and Worowan Abdurrahman's work, introducing some of the questions that I'm asking about witnessing and world building, or witnessing as world building, and how techniques of opacity, fabulation, and fugitivity open different possibilities for imaginations of liberation and solidarity within the ongoingness of dispossession. I'm going to briefly then discuss world building in the wake, the program that I curated as a fellow at Dara الفنون, and then discuss the essay film Kings and Extras, Digging for a Palestinian Image, from the director Azal Hassan, and the concept of fabulation in response to archival theft and erasure. and then I'll return to the videos and installations of Abbas and Abu Rahme. So I want to begin by just thinking about testimony outside of the frameworks of evidence or trauma. I'm thinking first with a brilliant essay by the Palestinian scholar Samra Esmair, 1948, Law, Memory, History, in which she writes about a court case in Israel that raised questions about the massacre in the village of Tantura that year. It is the only case in Israeli legal history that investigated the truth of a particular massacre during the Nakba. The case arose in the first place because of a Jewish Israeli student who interviewed survivors and wrote about them in his thesis, which was labeled libelous by Zionist soldiers who had been in Tantura in 1948. But this is less important than how the evidence itself was considered. Esmair shows how the system of positivist law, which was inherited from the British, structurally prevents Palestinian testimony from appearing as anything but so-called hearsay evidence. And she shows the complicity of historiography with law in this respect, writing about, quote, the positivist historian's conception of a linear progressive history which separates past from present, focuses on isolated events, locates individual actors, and attempts to discover direct causal relations. Survivors of the Nakba, separated from the people and places in which their memories reside, and still subject to an ongoing catastrophe, don't typically remember distinct events undertaken in a chronological passage of time by particular Zionist militias or soldiers. They hold on to what Esmair calls a different conception of time, in which past and present are not separate, and in which the emphasis is not on isolatable and describable events or massacres, but on the terror that governed Palestinian lives during the war. And so Esmair calls for, quote, a different reading of the testimonies, a reading that would try to understand the tragedy of a society in the absences and gaps. I also want to propose a different reading of testimonies that emerges from their absences and gaps, using them as sites to imagine otherwise. And I'm beginning with this image from Only the Beloved Keeps Our Secrets, a video by Bاسل Abbas and Worowan Abu Rahme from 2016, where just, you know, in the middle of the screen, very minimally, you can see a 14-year-old boy, a Palestinian who was killed by Israeli soldiers for crossing the so-called separation fence in order to pick Akub. This was captured on a surveillance camera, and so there's that footage, but also the moon here, the sun, and the sea, and dances. And I want to think about some of these sort of cosmic elements as what we think of as part of the activity of witnessing, or the realm in which witnessing takes place, alongside the visible, and specifically the visible that can be recorded in ways that the Israeli state, or that any capitalist colonial state, you know, thinks of visibility in a certain way. So my questions are, how do Palestinian artists and filmmakers bear witness to structural violence in ways that transcend the evidentiary? How can we conceive of critical acts of bearing witness and testifying to counter histories without relying on forms of speech, visibility, and identity that are constructed as legible and sympathetic through colonial frames? What might visual or narrative sovereignty mean for a people denied political sovereignty? How might the opacity of the Palestinian witness, or acts of witnessing that refuse processes of exposure, translation, and circulation, engender new forms of relational witnessing and co-resistance? Can an aesthetics imbued with opacity, irresolution, fantasy, humor, the everyday and the minor point to a politics of solidarity other than that produced or foreclosed by raw images of violence? In what ways do Palestinian artists and filmmakers also not only represent the realities of ongoing dispossession, but also theorize, allegorize, and think beyond such conditions? So I want to consider witnessing, as I'm suggesting, as a visionary activity, which uses faculties of the imagination to sense beyond the immediately perceptible, as a process in which memories of unrealized political potential and ongoing practices of autonomy and care meet the violence of settler colonialism with the sense that it can be otherwise. Witnessing in this conception is not only testimony to traumatic events, it is the continual reconstruction of what happened into what could have been and what might still be. And in speaking of visionary witnessing, I want to note that I don't want to overstate vision itself. I want to deprivilege the sense of sight in thinking about the importance of sound and vibration in Abbas and Abu Rahme's work, and more broadly in thinking about the poetics and politics of opacity as a kind of withdrawal from standardized forms of visibility, not from visibility entirely. Opacity is not, as Edouard Glissant, the poet and theorist who writes about opacity in his Poétique de la Relation, says opacity is not obscurity. It's a kind of conditional withdrawal, let's say, from forms of visibility that are imposed as a universal standard, that in a sense, are this kind of condescending multiculturalism. He's speaking about the French that include only insofar as the formerly colonial subject or the colonial subject is recognized as human, as a good speaker, as eloquent, whatever it is, according to colonial standards. So in thinking about the poetics and politics of opacity, and also in suggesting that a multisensory form of witnessing, that is one open to hearing, to listening, to seeing, to feeling, also opens onto a kind of suprasensory witnessing, that is of other times and places, real and potential, that emerge in the passage from perception to imagination. Abbas and Abu Rahme's breakthrough video installation, The Incidental Insurgents, from 2012 to 2015, as well as their following video, And Yet My Mask is Powerful, from 2015, represent anonymous figures seen from the back as they look out at Palestinian landscapes, sometimes from within ruined and abandoned Palestinian homes, survey the occupation's architecture of confinement, or stand at the mouths of caves and other thresholds between the hidden and the visible, bearing witness not to the violence of the present, but to the possibilities for world building within and against a colonized space. They remain silent and nearly still, like Naji al-Ali's Handala or Elia Suleiman's Quiet Observer ES, and they retain an absolute anonymity, never showing their faces. We do not meet their gaze, and we cannot identify their features. Instead, we look on from their perspective, while attuning ourselves to the affects, desires, and commitments that emerge in the resonances and frictions the artists generate through sound, image, and text. The videos that comprise the incidental insurgents, there are 3, are edited rhythmically, animated by the interplay between the electronic soundscapes and the yellow English and Arabic text that flashes on screen over the human figures, landscapes, and roads. And I should mention that the artists also have a music practice and performance practice, just as a background, though I don't get into it much today. Staticky ambient music bubbles and swells, glitches, stutters, crackles, and crescendos, holding tension as if a beat is perpetually about to drop. Meanwhile, short declarative phrases materialize for a moment and sometimes reappear in accelerating intervals. The on-screen text, sampled from various literary and revolutionary manuscripts, from Roberto Bolaño's novel The Savage Detectives to the French anarchist Victor Serge's writings, invokes returns, openings, and awakenings, moments of urgency and potential that stand outside the linear unfolding of time. The relative stillness and inaction of the human characters, in sync with their barren surroundings, contrast sharply with both the discordant sounds, and the poetic and political fervor of the text. This polarity, I'd suggest, is precisely the measure of another interval between the impasses of the present, in which the unrealized potential of historic uprisings and radical visions lays fallow, and an uncertain future in which the seeds of liberation are sown. I call this an opaque relational form of witnessing, one that posits a right to opacity, in Glissant's words, by untethering the act of witnessing from the revelation and translation of what one has witnessed. The witnesses are not named, which is to say they are not humanized, made sympathetic and visible according to the conventions of the sorts of realist dramas and documentaries championed at human rights film festivals. They refuse humanitarian documentary modes of representing Palestinians and more broadly people from the global South who come to be known under the captions of refugee, conflict, victim. Their opacity, again, like that suggested by Glissant, is a refusal to be exposed to an ethnographic gaze that scans and probes the racialized subject for measures of a non-threatening humanity, the innocent child, the simple, resilient peasant woman, the upstanding, stoic family man. Rather than appeal to viewers to sympathize with what Palestinians have endured through a sober account of the facts that counters familiar Israeli claims in terms formulated to persuade an audience from the global North, the artists solicit a solidarity rooted in a shared desire to leave behind the partitions of the final dream, to join these opaque figures in witnessing and in creating another world. So from where do we leave these partitions? I want to speak a little bit about the significance of the cave pictured a number of times in the incidental insurgents as a place of refuge, as an extraterritorial shelter from the partitions of time and space given by a given polity, and in this case, a colonial polity, and as a threshold between the unseen and the seen, or the dark and the light, an opening onto past and future alike. Palestine's many caves have, as probably many people here know better than I, been in reality a refuge for many Palestinians hiding from Zionist or British troops, as they were thousands of years earlier for Jewish people hiding from Roman invaders. In the context of the research for the incidental insurgents, caves were a resting place for the Palestinian bandit and popular hero of the early 1930s, Abu Jilde, where his wife would bring him food. He was also arrested by the British in the cave, still under mysterious circumstances. Also in Elias Khouri's Bab al-Shams, the narrator recounts how a Fida'i, who was expelled from his Galilee village and kept returning across the border to visit his wife who remained, met his wife in the cave, where they ate together, made love, and for these fleeting moments lived together. It symbolizes the one free plot of Palestine in ways that in a longer talk I'd get into. And for this reason, when Palestinian activists reclaimed land about to be colonized by settlers in January 2013, they named it Bab al-Shams, after the novel, before being forced off it by the Israeli army after 6 days. The cave is also present in two other famous narratives of Palestine, the Pesoptimist, Emil Habibi's Pesoptimist, as well as Anton Shamas's Arabesques. As the scholar Lita Levy notes, the cave is, quote, an alternative spatiality representing both the Palestine that no longer is and the Palestine that is not yet. And I'm developing, in ways that I won't speak to here, an idea kind of the cave as an opaque portal to Palestine. It is a space to recalibrate the senses, to sense beyond seeing. There's a slide I don't have here from Abbas and Abu Rahme where they have the words eyes wide shut. I think becoming alert in that sense to a presencing of an absence or a negativity, the way that a gap becomes an opening, as suggested here, and of course in Arabic, bab, door is also gateway and is close to the word for portal as well, the same root. and through a kind of consciousness here that emerges when witnessing is no longer seeing and is not linked to the unfolding of chronological time. I'm thinking also about Vivienne Sansour, who has written beautifully about the unseen as fertile ground for new wisdom. And I've been thinking alongside Stefania Pandolfo, an anthropologist who joins psychoanalytic theory with the thought of Ibn Arabi and others on the imaginal, as she writes ethnographies that take place in asylums and within basically the outskirts of Rabat, where young, poor, and working class men are considering migration, considering suicide. And she writes about the imaginal as a kind of ontology of the invisible, or al-ghaib, which of course has connotations of absence and many other things that are relevant to the condition of exile. And I think that, you know, like forms of opacity, the imaginal is at once present and absent, which is, you know, crucial to the Palestinian condition. It is, in Pandolfo's words, a negativity that disrupts the surface of the positive reality. So that is a gap, an absence, a nothingness that, or something that is there but undetectable, which in that sense shows the falsity of what is presented as real, what is presented as fact, what is presented as the positive of society through its withdrawal or through the kind of distortion that it presents in a narrative or in an image. Edward Said has a line from After the Last Sky that Abbas and Abu Rahmeh quotes in their video, their latest video, whose title I'll get to at the end. I'm forgetting the longer title, also from Said, At Those Terrifying Frontiers, where he says, you know, we appear as dislocations in their discourse. So the idea of Palestinians almost being a kind of like an absence that interrupts without themselves or ourselves being perceptible as beings as such. So negativities that change the fabric of reality in some way. And she also writes about the imaginal in a sense that I think connects to what I'm trying to say about witnessing, that it points to a conception of the imagination as an organ of active perception and cognition of suprasensory realities capable of making appear dimensions of the world, human and divine, not immediately accessible to human experience. So there's maybe a question, why turn back to Ibn Arabi, why the imaginal, why the divine in this sense? And I want to, you know, suggest here that truth of the divine witnessed in the imaginal world may also be something like liberation or decolonization. That is the truth of a world that, because it is dreamt of, exists in certain realities that we can make. And I think that Pandolfo does a great job of showing the imbrication of this kind of thought in the fabric of daily life and daily struggle. And yeah, of course, I developed that more in writing, but don't have time for it here. But it's also important, I think, to think about, you know, witnessing or seeing beyond vision in light of the particular landscape of incarceration that Palestinians are increasingly subject to. So this is a quote from Bاسل, Abbas, and Worowan Abu Rahmeh. When we first started working together, we didn't feel that we could pick up the camera and film in Palestine. Images from Palestine had lost their potency, and I'm going to speak a little bit about images in particular from the Second Intifada, and in a way responses to those kinds of images. The repetition of the same images had almost taken the breath out of them. They were stagnating. At the same time, the situation on the ground was going through a kind of stagnation. We were stuck in the same discourses, but also literally stuck between checkpoints and walls. Our lines of vision had been quite literally obscured and occupied by the occupation. Our geographies would abruptly end when we reached a concrete wall and a sealed metal gate. the military wall is not only a spatial tool of oppression, but a visual one. It severs the horizon of vision, and in that, the horizon of any futurity. Oh, why is it not switching slides? Sorry. So, along with spaces like caves and windows, which are thresholds of different kinds, there are also many shots of horizons, of dawn and dusk, sunrise and sunset, these moments of passages between spaces and times that suggest that maybe in that gap, in that transition, in that liminal space, there is the possibility of seeing beyond the horizons that are curtailed in the present world and into another way of being. So I'm going to shift gears a bit here to connect this to some of the work that I've been doing at Daratul الفنون, where I've been fortunate to curate a series that was initially an accompaniment to the Darat program and exhibition Post-Colonial Ecologies, curated by Jude Al-Tamimi, Firas Shahade, and Reem Marji, while Darat was still operating entirely online at the time. So the series of talks, Worldbuilding in the Wake, began from the premise that our climate's collapse, rooted in the enduring structures of settler colonialism and racial capitalism, generalizes the condition of the end of the world that has already been experienced by indigenous communities and people around the world who have suffered slavery, genocide, other calamities. In other words, apocalypse is a structure, not an event. The catastrophe is ongoing. Or as Sun Ra puts it, it's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? I'm interested in Afrofuturism and other subaltern futurisms because their visions of the yet to come are always also returns to the cultural practices, ways of knowing, and freedom dreams of those whose worlds were destroyed. So positioning the speculative practice of world building as a poetic act of repairing present and future ecologies in the wake of imperial violence, this series featured artists, writers, and scholars who are imagining and building worlds beyond the extractive systems that have endangered the diversity of forms of life on this planet. Historian Nadia Speti gave a talk, the first one, on teaching science fiction in Lebanon in the midst of revolution, pandemic, and collapse. And Vivian Sansour, to give another example, spoke about the worlds that are made and remade by reconnecting with indigenous food practices in Palestine. And these are all on Darat al-Fnun's YouTube, as all of their talks are. So I want to say a bit about what I mean by in the wake and how I've been thinking through this, including with artists in the Summer Academy, where we discussed the meanings of the wake or other forms of sort of afterlives. I'm referring first of all to a book called In the Wake by Christina Sharp, which is and the subtitle is On Blackness and Being, refers specifically to the condition of living in the wake of slavery, in the wake of so many disasters of anti-Black racism, which in her telling are both sort of large scale and structural in the sense of discrimination, education, health, justice, but also deeply intimate, felt, on the skin and in one's being. And she speaks to her own personal family experiences of death and loss. But she, the beautiful thing about this book are the many meanings that she draws out of the wake as a word. She thinks of the wake as a kind of as a funeral ceremony, the ritual of remembering the dead. She speaks of a wake as the traces of a ship or of a body in a water, evoking both slave ships and refugee rafts. Wake also is connected to being awake, to consciousness, to being alert or aware of one's history. Before the term was perverted, one would say woke. It has now almost become pejorative without that initial sense of in which Black Americans were using it to say aware of one's history. And also the wake as the kind of enduring ripples of a catastrophe, taking that metaphor from the water. So I've been thinking about these poetic connotations of the wake alongside what Saidiya Hartman has called the afterlife of slavery, and also in relation to thought in the Arab region, what Walid Sadeh has called the protracted now of civil war, as he calls for lingering in the presence of the corpse. So for Sadeh, like Sharp, the question is how to stay and build a stay in the time of the corpse. There's also Jalal Tawfiq's distinct notion of the surpassing disaster, which I don't have a time to address here today, but each of these temporalities of disaster, and one could also think about Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence, offer ways of thinking an ongoing catastrophe as both the Palestinian condition and what might be generalized as the condition of coloniality, 1948 also being 1619 and 1492. And for the purposes of my dissertation, I want to say too, the wake is not only 1948, but also 1982. I situate my dissertation in an era of political impasse after the defeat of party-led army struggles and the failures, or rather successes in the eyes of Israel and the US, of official peace negotiations. And as popular uprisings from the First Intifada to this year's Unity uprising have inspired grassroots solidarity without yet resulting in any significant steps toward liberation. So I begin with the landmark year of 1982, when Israel invaded Beirut, then the center of Palestinian cultural and political life, and compelled the PLO to leave Lebanon in defeat. This marked the end of a 15-year period in which a broad array of Palestinians came to understand themselves as revolutionaries, not refugees, and politically committed intellectuals publicized their cause around the world through resistance literature, theater, painting, and third cinema-like documentaries that were funded by leftist and nationalist political parties. After 1982, as I'm going to speak about, those documentaries were all lost, robbing Palestinians of a critical visual history. Most of the material was later found in Israel's military archives, and once again raising the question of how to build collective narrative in the absence of stable archives and cultural institutions. So I don't have too much time to get to this, but I just wanted to say that also some of my thinking around world building and speculative fiction emerges from, reading Kojo Eshun in particular. Many of you probably know this essay, Future Considerations on Afrofuturism, where he's both writing about Afrofuturism and imagining a future United States of the African Federation, I think the USAF is, in which basically this Pan-African set of archaeologists are looking back to trace what it was to be an African artist back in the 20th century. And so here, the really interesting tension to me is, the need for counter memory, for resuscitating histories of the forgotten, how it overpowers the ability to imagine other futures, what they're saying then about Afrofuturism, in a sense, emerging only against the very real sort of wariness towards futurity, both in terms of that being what he calls an unethical dereliction of duty to counter memory, but also in the face of the defeat of utopian socialisms of different forms. And he uses the word utopia, but also, they were very real and happening at the moment of formal decolonization, but of course defeated by many US, UK, and France-backed coups, as well as other reasons. And so I want to think about that, of course, too, in terms of, what Palestinian liberation looks like beyond the organized revolutionary struggles of the moment of formal decolonization. And so Kojo Ashun's writing is connected to this film by John Akomfra, The Last Angel of History, which imagines a data thief that travels back in time to the 20th century to crack the code of blackness. And I just bring this, sort of these two images, one of Larissa Sansur's In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain with The Last Angel of History, to think about these figures, the narrative terrorist in Larissa Sansur's film and the data thief in John Akomfra's, each of them suggesting that one has to sort of appropriate the labels of criminality given to oneself as a fugitive subject, as a illegalized subject, as someone labeled criminal, whatever one does, in order to think about what it means to infiltrate the imperial archive, to transform an archive by entering it through this reappropriation of criminality, which also I think is really important for thinking about Abbas and Abu Rahmi's work, of course, because of the kind of label of the incidental insurgent and the tracing of different bandits and criminals with anarchist tendencies or with sort of popular redistributive tendencies. Also, just the phrase from Bolaño, savage detective, I think similarly does this work of both reappropriating the insult given to indigenous or global South communities, together with the work of seeking, right? Always a truth seeking that has to be fugitive in order to slip by. So yeah, I won't focus too much on these speculative Palestinian examples, but just to say that they're very everyday, even emerging in this Twitter thread. Many of you probably know, tweet as if it's free. Okay, so jumping ahead here to Dreams of a Nation, which was the first Palestinian film festival in the United States back in 2003, organized by Anne-Marie Jasser and Hamid Dabashi at Columbia University. And then a book anthology that emerged from the festival, edited by Dabashi, which is notable for laying the groundwork for much of the English language discourse on Palestinian film to follow. And there are a lot of excellent essays in the book. Dabashi's intro lays out general definitions of Palestinian cinema, beginning with the premise that it builds a national imagination in the absence of a Palestinian state by providing visual evidence of historical realities repressed or ignored by the world. So he justifiably argues, in a sense, that the central trauma of Palestine, the Nakba, is the defining moment of Palestinian cinema, and speaks to that tension between the nation and the state and what it means for thinking about a national cinema. And speaking at the festival, also, Edward Said famously stated the whole history of the Palestinian struggle has to do with the desire to be visible. So in a sense, the festival, the book as a whole, sort of presents this problematic of visibility and evidence, as well as countering a colonial record that I think has dominated a lot of the discussions of Palestinian cinema, and also has, in the years since the Second Intifada and since this moment, I think been doubted increasingly as artists try to find a new language beyond that of kind of countering. So to say a bit more about what I mean there, so it's strange that Dabashi links the event of the Nakba, I think, to a particular mode of filmmaking deemed capable of conveying its historical urgency, which he calls traumatic realism. Even including Elia Suleiman and many, sort of non-realist filmmakers within that label. And in a sense, limiting cinema's role to providing a visual record of suffering that counters Zionist myths. So though he speaks of a record lodged in a place that escapes the reach of the colonizer as occupier, his argument largely reduces the aesthetics and politics of Palestinian cinema to a capacity to testify to the Israeli regime's abuses. And this, for me, highlights the limits of a paradigm of resistance that's rooted in countering colonial power, where countering the colonized essentially cede the ground of discourse to the colonizer by rejecting their myths and misinformation, proving against their claims that one is human, that one has been present on the land, that one, didn't fire the first shot and was innocent, and so on. I love this quote from Abbas and Abu Rahme, where they say, "We are thinking about decolonization as the activation of new grounds from which to not be docile towards colonial time, narrative, and space. In order to resist regimes of erasure, we need to not always begin from or be bound within colonial logic or language. This is what we are searching for. In that process, we point to the incomplete nature of the colonial project and all that escapes its logic and domination whilst being subjected to it." So the indigenous scholar Audra Simpson might call this refusal rather than resistance. So rather than, countering and presenting a model of Palestinian cinema that, shares our side of the story, it's a refusal of sides as such, a refusal to enter into a discursive space that's built on the predication of erasing the Palestine that was and the Palestine that can be, and finding an autonomous language that emerges from indigenous cultural practices, as well as imaginaries that are outside of the existing political discourse. So I don't want to make this also into like indigenous authenticity against the colonial invaders or something like that, because of course this isn't about identity as such, and a large part of the Palestinian bourgeoisie is trapped within that discourse. A large part of the Palestinian political parties are trapped within that discourse. So it has to do also with ideological allies in a sense, or with people who are thought to be on the same side. Which brings me also to Edward Said's essay, Permission to Narrate. It's a famous essay written in the wake of Israel's 1982 invasion of Beirut and the failure to hold either Israel or the Lebanese Falangist leaders accountable for the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Said notes that the many human rights reports that extensively documented Israeli war crimes were insufficient to persuade Western publics or overcome US media censorship. There was an international commission assembled by the Irish human rights lawyer, Sean McBride, that detailed Israeli targeting of schools and hospitals, killing of thousands of civilians, and the oversight of Sabra and Shatila, which concluded the facts speak for themselves. So Said uses this cliche as a kind of impetus to discuss the limits of what he calls counter-evidence in mobilizing solidarity. He writes, "Facts do not at all speak for themselves, but require a socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them." And he lamented that Palestinians were denied permission to narrate their experiences by geopolitical foes, yes, but also ideological sympathizers. In this case, Noam Chomsky is the one he focuses on most, who are beholden to the reality of facts. I love this line, quoting Gramsci or paraphrasing Gramsci: "Pessimism of the intellect and pessimism of the will." But most Palestinians would say in response, if those are the facts, then so much worse for the facts. So I build on Said's insights in this essay by highlighting the pressure that many humanitarian NGOs, Palestinian leaders, and pro-Palestinian voices like Dabashi place upon Palestinian cultural producers to dutifully document evidence of their suffering, as if we needed more. I name these kind of denials of a permission to fabulate, which to me is at once to narrate and to imagine, to speculate and to theorize, to conjure other worlds from within ongoing catastrophe. So fabulation is a term used by Gilles Deleuze in his film theory, where it's a form of cinematic narrative associated with the powers of the false, enabling a becoming otherwise and the emergence of a reality not rooted in the evidence of a world captured by the camera. And it also is something that's often said about Lebanese post-war artists, Walid Rad's The Atlas Group, for example, fabricating ostensibly documentary material to at once appropriate the documentarian's authority in order to supplement fragmentary archives with excluded truths, but at the same time to undermine that authority by foregrounding the fallacies and fantasies of memory making as constitutive of emergent truths. And there's Saidiya Hartman's notion of critical fabulation, a mode of writing that she describes in relation to the violence of the archives of slavery. She asks, basically, if all the documents pertaining to the lives of enslaved Black women record them only as property, as commodities to be exploited economically and sexually, then how can one tell their story without reiterating their dehumanization? And for her, it's not enough to expose and critique their erasure, and it would be falsely redemptive to narrate a counterfactual history that symbolically restores what has been lost. So she proposes a kind of counter-history at the intersection of the fictive and the historical, which registers the opacity of what cannot be known, even as it animates certain silences to sketch the contours of what might have been. So I write about fabulation in the essay film Kings and Extras, Digging for a Palestinian Image, directed by the Palestinian Jordanian filmmaker Aza al-Hassan, which tells the story of the filmmaker's search for the archive of Palestinian films kept by the Palestinian Cinema Institute, which held more than 100 documentaries made during the Thawra period under the aegis of Fatah, the PFLP, and the DFLP. And at the time of her filming, it was unclear if the archive had been bombed or looted or if it remained hidden in Beirut. So she was going around and asking people, including many of the filmmakers involved in establishing or contributing to the archive. Since then, copies of several of the films have been found in the homes of filmmakers' relatives and in cultural centers around the world. And a number of these films have been restored and screened by artisan filmmakers, including Anne-Marie Jasser, Emily Jasser, Mohamed Yacoubi, and Al-Hassan herself. In 2017, the Israeli scholar Rona Sella made public new elements of her research into cultural material looted by Israel, and she explained that she had basically been permitted to view some of these films that were lost in Israel's military archives. So before leaving Beirut, she suggests Israeli forces were ordered to raid all PLO-affiliated offices, and it appears that many, if not all of the films, were looted then. But the aim of Al-Hassan's film is not to retrieve the missing archive so much as exhume the moving images that animated it, as suggested by the subtitle. So these images, were shot by Palestinian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon, and during a period of revolutionary struggle. So were elements of a collective Palestinian project of world building. World building meaning here the making of a community and the imagination of a world inclusive of oppressed peoples beyond Palestine and Arab nations. There was solidarity with Vietnam, South Africa, and so on. A world free from racism and colonialism. So their significance lies not only in their historic documentation of Palestinian life in the refugee camps and on the front lines of guerrilla struggle, but in their nascent and evolving conceptions of how to sculpt a Palestinian image and a Palestinian narrative in the wake of the destruction of Palestine. Self-reflexive and also fable-like at times, Al-Hassan's documentary contests the meaning of evidence and widens the scope of what is admissible to archives. Rather than seek to furnish incontrovertible evidence of her characters' stories, she creates a dissonant archive that animates their narratives outside the framework of proof. And I think I'm going to skip over some of this so I can get to some later images. But basically Kings of Extras, sort of creates its own, Kings and Extras creates its own sort of archive through these interviews with everyday people on the streets of Amman, Beirut, Damascus, Ramallah, and in refugee camps, while also critiquing in a kind of playful, satirical way, the representations of Palestinians, again, even when, by not Orientalist or anti-Palestinian representations, but supposedly pro-Palestinian representations, like in this Iranian film filmed in a refugee camp outside Damascus. What it does is, opens with this kind of opaque view of the camp. It never, says where we are in the way the documentaries typically do, or has any kind of establishing shot. Instead, we go right into her interviews with people who are speaking about the film, and speak about it in a way that also uses the kind of gestures and words, and in her framing the shots that suggest a kind of indexical reality, right? Literally pointing, this is what happened, this is what the Israelis did, this is the destruction, and yet it's a simulation of it. So it raises this question about what it does to trace a kind of indexical evidence, while also, blurring the lines between fiction and reality in a way that she's suggesting is also operative in the hegemonic discourse, which requires this kind of myth making, of course. So I'm going to skip ahead some and just close by saying then she has this kind of figuration of fabulation when she narrates an imagined film above the blurry images of a film reel that was left decaying in a camera for 22 years. So she basically edits in some images of her own over totally blurry images, and her narration goes, I imagined that inside the film was another film, The Exiled Return Home. I imagined that for a few seconds defeat ends and the victims win, and their images is transformed. Their image is transformed, sorry, speaking a lot. So I'll finish up soon too, as I think I need a little bit of a pause for discussion. So she is presenting this kind of image of repair out of fabulation that that comes from loss, that comes in the midst of decay. And it's something to think about alongside the idea of staying in loss, and whether repair, I think, is, something that is a kind of making whole, or in this case, a transformative return in which the victims become kind of kings, as if, reversing the extras and kings in her title. Or if it requires sort of staying in the moment of loss and building from there. The following scene goes to a man in the refugee camp who zooms in on a kind of shirt with the number 48 from it, so sort of undermines, or rather troubles, this easy form of repair that might seem to emerge from this scene. So in addition to, I was going to say, if El Hassan's film responds to the condition of always being narrated as part of a kind of drama that is not one's own, with this fable of search and emergence, she's also responding to always being the subject of film. This is from her earlier essay film News Time, which was set in the midst of the Intifada while she's living in Ramallah. And, it's called News Time because she and her neighbors are all the subjects of the news. So I want to close with a consideration of opacity in Basil Abbas and Ran Abu Rahme's work, because that's also sort of a turn away from forms of narrative, even fabulation, and away from visibility, opacity as a response here to being the news, being surveilled by Israeli control mechanisms, forms of visibility that are legitimated by NGOs, and also forms of visibility demanded by Arab nationalism in different ways, as well as a kind of broader ethnographic gaze. I think I meant to say that later. Sorry for the confusion, but basically I want to end also on this idea of a kind of poetics of citation as an opening onto opacity, right? So they're in their videos often sampling words like musical phrases. In this case, in And Yet My Mask is Powerful, from an Adrienne Rich poem, and previously from, as I said, Roberto Bolaño, Victor Serge, and Abu Jilde. And the idea behind citation, beyond building on many voices, is the idea that, you know, in a sense, revolutionary impulses are always present at one place or another in the world. And it's a kind of bringing back of these different figures that are always returning in different bodies, in different places, but are kinds of spirits that are always possible. So anonymity is also the mark of return and the mark of collectivity. And I want to relate this to Fred Moten's ideas about fugitivity and being in common, where, you know, for him, I would say that, you know, dispossession appears as a kind of opening onto the common, as a precondition for being in common, that freedom is only possible in fugitivity. In his book, Stolen Life, Consent Not to Be a Single Being, and that phrase, consent not to be a single being, which I think is, you know, really apropos of the kind of collectivity that Abbas and Abu Rahme are building, comes from Edouard Glissant, one of the people that Moten is thinking with. So he writes, "It's not mine, but it's all I have. I who have nothing, I who am no one, I who am not one." And similarly, Abbas and Abu Rahme speak of concealment as a movement from the singular to the common. I also want to bring Pandolfo's thought back into this, where she points out that Ibn al-Arabi distinguishes between al-khayal al-mutasil, like imagination of a single person that depends on the existence of an individual subject, and al-khayal al-munfasil, the existence of imagination beyond a subject. So a kind of autonomous presence, constantly receptive towards meanings and spirits. And so that is enacted in And Yet My Mask is Powerful through this reclamation of masks that had been looted from the West Bank and were displayed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem with a Zionist narrative that erased the historic presence of Palestinians on the land. Abbas and Abu Rahme 3D printed replicas of these masks based on images that they found, how they reconstructed basically a 3D image from various images through Google, entirely virtual, because one of them does not have the identity cards necessary to enter Jerusalem, among other reasons. So depending on this kind of virtuality, because of a forced distance too, there's a power in being a virtual collective that is evoked through the words of Adrienne Rich, as well as through the masks themselves. And I want to close with the brief mention of their latest video, At Those Terrifying Frontiers, where the existence and disappearance of people fade into each other, which is taking avatars that you see here based on images of protesters in Gaza during the Great March of Return that began in 2018. and sort of generates them with these glitches that became kinds of scars, as if mimicking the maiming that that the Israeli army was doing every time that Palestinians approached their homes, approached the homes they were running back to, that is, approached what they call the border fence. And it's a kind of, and also I should have said that phrase is from Edward Said's After the Last Sky poetic book, accompanied by John Moore's photography. And so all the text from the video is also from that book. It takes on, basically this idea of survival within an environment hostile to you, and how identity is reformulated in that space of erasure and dispossession. And so I want to close here with thinking about what imagination does in a kind of response to not being able to breathe somewhere. Fanon wrote in an essay called Racism and Culture, the object of racism is no longer a person, but a form of existence. He's partly tracing the movement from what's often called biological to cultural racism. But I love this phrase, a form of existence. And I should note that's in Stefania Pandolfo's translation from the French, to say that, there are forms of life that are being erased by colonialism more than there are individual people. And to colonize a native population, Fanon reminds us, its systems of reference have to be broken. So expropriation, spoliation, raids, objective murder are matched by the sacking of cultural patterns, he writes. And I wanted to pair that with Bاسل Abbas's comment. I think he made this comment when speaking about the video in a recent talk at Cooper Union at the series curated by Omar Barada and Leslie Hewitt. What happens when you linger in the broken rather than try to heal it? So in a sense, it's a kind of comment against repair as making whole, as I was talking about earlier with reference to Aza al-Hassan. But I want to end with Pandolfo here, saying, first of all, culture in agony, that is the decultured, colonized culture that Fanon writes about, no longer supports being, thinking, and dreaming, or generating new forms in a process of world making. So for her, repair is not making whole, but rather a repossession of imagination, which is also a decolonization of desire. And I want to close with that as a suggestion of witnessing as world building, what that may be in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem.
Did I stop sharing successfully there?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yes. So thanks again for a great presentation. Just reminding the audience that they can send in their questions via the Q&A window in Zoom. I hope we get some really good questions. You can send them anytime starting now. And Kareem, I want to start by I want to start by looking at archiving as a process of historicization. Like in her essay on archiving as dissonance, Anne Stoller recalls Merleau-Ponty when he considered the present as burdened with unequally distributed multiple temporalities. In the Palestinian context, the present is littered with various complex political and social temporalities. So thinking of a history that was never present, along with so many different scattered histories in the Palestinian context again, not as a process of a recall, but more of speculation, thinking in your terms too. So when it comes to building a Palestinian archive that could be useful as a resource for speculation or fabulation. What do you think? Like, what would a Palestinian archive, from your perspective, look like? What could it include, and also should it disclude anything too?
I mean, I think that the idea of a Palestinian archive, in a sense, is important because it displaces most definitions of archives, in that it is going to be extraterritorial and non-state. It's going to have to emerge from many different places. It's going to contend with what Ann Stoler is calling dissensus, which, you know, is also an important term in thinking about art. Jacques Rancière uses it to talk about, you know, the kind of importance of clashing what is excluded from visibility with what is commonly included in the visible or the sensible. But I mean, I want to also, you know, move out of theory a little and say that there are tons of amazing archival practices in the Palestinian case, and that's important as we think about what a Palestinian archive is and can be, right? That, you know, there are oral history archives that have been gathered, for example, in the camps in Lebanon. There are also projects being undertaken to record folk tales that are being basically passing out of existence sometimes as elders pass on. These are all sort of unauthorized community projects, basically. They exist orally, they exist digitally, and, you know, I think what this points to that I really want to say here is that the archive, in a sense, is an imaginary more than it is an institution. It is what can be said about a particular subject or history. And so in the Palestinian instance, it's important that, you know, reflect the many divides within Palestinian society, that is across class and gender lines, for example, and also, you know, against a dominant nationalist narrative. The anthropologist Rosemary Sayegh has done great work on speaking with refugee women in Lebanon to talk about how their histories often sort of subverted the histories that were given by the men in that camp, that often recorded like main battles, but didn't have quieter forms of refusal or resistance, for example. And that's something that interests me, those everyday practices of refusal that might go unnoticed. So yeah, those are a few scattered answers to your big question.
Because since you've mentioned that, like, of course, there are so many already existing Palestinian archives, independent archives, if I may say, and I just remembered that we hosted a few weeks ago Ahmed Nabil, the founder of the Fiction Council, who's building an archive that also includes the fantastical, like the stories of the everyday stories of jinn and possession, and like ghost stories from the local population in Jerusalem and elsewhere. But here, I like also specifically in the Palestinian context, we can think of three different competing projects that are going on at the same time. We have this independent Palestinian archive, we can call it the People's Archive, and we also have the official nation state building project, which is the PA's archive, and it manifests in museums in the same way that, like, any nation state uses museums as the cornerstone of its national myth. So we have, like, in between three. How do you see them? How do you see this conflict? Like, how do you read it?
That's an important question. I don't know if I can really address that, honestly. Not, you know, I think that, I mean, from my position, I mean, I'm someone of Palestinian descent whose family had to leave in '48, and I've only once been in the West Bank, and so I think I have much less grasp of what the PA is doing and how that kind of official archive for what they think of, if they even think of it anymore, as a state in waiting, clashes with the many unauthorized archives in exile. So I'm curious, are you posing that with a thought on that?
I'm just thinking, will it always be a conflict of narratives forever?
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to think about this in the context of, revolutionary movements that eventually, formed states, and how things became ossified or repressed in that moment of state formation. So, there definitely could be very interesting comparative work, on lots of, for example, African states that achieved decolonization in the 50s and 60s. But yeah, I'm not sure if I know how to answer that question. Yeah.
Also, I'm thinking, like, since there's always an emphasis on the collectivity of the process of fabulation, and as it often, like, at the same time, it often includes contrasting ideologies, like what stories are being collected, and like when it comes to fabulation, like who are you looking at? Who are the ones who are supposed to fabulate?
Well,
Is it
I think
across cultural or across class, or how do you look at the like the conflicts? I'm always like interested in the conflicts and the tensions when it comes to storytelling.
yeah. I mean, I think first of all, it's important to identify different levels of fabulation, right? This word can be used as a kind of cinematic technique. It could be used as a kind of history writing, or it could be used as just a popular form of narrative imagination. So, to begin with that popular form, you can just think of how most Palestinian camps are organized, which is by the villages that people came from, often with street names and institution names that are specific places or streets from the former villages and towns. And that is a kind of fabulation for sure, in the sense that that's imaginatively narrating a new place in relation to one's homeland, through which constructs this kind of imagination of the endurance of home and of return, both as returning to that place that one knows from the past, and return as the futurity of return as imagining what it will be to go back to a place, which then will, of course, carry the traces of the experience in the camp too. And that, is something that decolonizing architecture, for example, speaks very brilliantly about in terms of what they call refugee heritage. There's fabulation in terms of, cinema, which for me, both in the film and video works that I'm looking at, I'm trying to say is, about a kind of image making and editing in which different realities emerge than those that the camera is recording. So that allows this kind of witnessing that is beyond vision and that is beyond the empirical representation or indexical representation of something in front of a camera. And then there's also fabulation, which I think this is what you're sort of getting to with these tensions. That's about that kind of, how do you write history when most of it is unrecorded, or has been deleted, or has been, overtaken by myths? So in that place, which imaginative histories that have some bearing to what happened, but also fill in a lot of kind of what could have beens. Who writes those? And I turn to Azal Hassan's Kings and Extras because I think it's a beautiful model of the dissensus of that, of the tensions that I think you're pointing at, in that she's going across the borders of Lebanon Jordan, Syria, and the West Bank. And first of all, like, of course, conditions drastically differ across those states. I mean, the first camps that she films in no longer exist because of Assad's barrel bombing. The later ones that she is working in Lebanon, there are dozens and dozens of laws that prevent Palestinians from having any kind of entry into work, into the economy, into any of the benefits that would come with citizenship. So it's not just that they're denied that as a formal label, but cut off from any forms of social life. But within Lebanon too, there's Mustafa Abu Ali and there's Khadija Habashne, who not super well off, but are living in apartments outside of the camps. Each of them do narrate those positions and those histories very differently. And she is, gathering those voices as altogether making a kind of fabulation or set of fabulations that becomes a living archive, an archive that's always changing in that sense. She as an artist is fabulating in her own way, and that's an artistic practice, as I was saying. But I think that, in terms of the history telling, the best one can hope for is dissensus and agonism.
And maybe like moving away from tension and all that, like thinking of Afrofuturism, which is something that you're pretty much interested in, and like, what do you think are the shared commonalities between Afrofuturism and, if I might put it, like Palestinian futurism? Here I'm thinking, of course, of Hartman's critical fabulation versus your concepts of reparative fabulations. Do you think like fabulation practices can be in cross-cultural solidarity? Can they be in conversation and perhaps inform each other?
Yeah, definitely. And for me, I mean, the crucial thing here is that solidarity be built on the basis of particular practices and visions within those futurisms rather than identities. So I think that there's a very bad tendency right now to see Afrofuturism, indigenous futurism, Arab futurism as so many ethnofuturisms, to use the word of a particular anthology on these futurisms that came out a few years ago. And while the authors themselves are critical of a turn towards ethno-nationalism and identity politics in different forms in their own introduction, I think it's unfortunate still to even use a term like that. And so for me, I mean, what connects these futurisms, that is, say, Afrofuturism and Palestinian futurism, as well as many different indigenous futurisms, is this idea that, in a sense, is against, right, the dominant futurism of the early 20th century avant-garde that celebrated progress, speed, technology, in which, technologies are kind of hacked in order to bring pasts that were repressed into a different future, and in which also there's a kind of image like the Sankofa bird that's often evoked in Afrofuturism, a Khan symbol from what is today Ghana, of a bird that reaches back to pick up an egg on its back. So this idea that in order for the future to be hatched, one needs to look backwards, one needs to go backwards. And so I think that kind of constant interplay between past, present, and future, rather than an idea of linear progress, as well as many science fictional tropes, of course, of invading distant planets, all of these. I mean, John Akomfra is wonderful, together with Kojo Ashun, in speaking about how so many science fiction narratives are actually settler guilt about enslavement and genocide. When you think about alien abduction, for example, abducting millions of people from another continent in order to breed them into your society. And so in short, I mean, I think it comes out of the basis of different practices of imagining futures that are connected to histories that have been repressed rather than any ethnic pairing. And I think, just an easy way to look at that would be Gulf futurism, which has none of the kind of introduction of other histories. It's only critical to the extent that it mimics and satirizes, which I think is not a very deep criticality, and is very distinct then from most Palestinian futurisms that I've seen.
I want to jump into Bاسل and Worwan's work because we also received a question on that. But first, how do you read their choice of displaying their videos in relation to their idea of witnessing? Like most of the works that are displayed through multi-channel installations, and there's a sense of simultaneity. Several things are happening at the same time. What does that do to the idea of narrative and chronology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't have time to address the installations themselves, so I'm glad that you asked that. I'll answer this both by speaking about multiple screens in terms of the installation, and also multiple screens in terms of screens within screens, as people would have seen from the images that I shared. So, often different rectangles done, laid over one over another, 4 or 5 on a screen. So I think, simultaneity is important in the sense of being here and there at once, both in place and time, which I think, it is about this idea of returns, that there are always these histories, moments of joy or mourning, moments of resistance or of protest or of just everyday life that surround us and that are part of a surround, that are part of an imaginary. And so, narrative, I think, is very relaxed, of course, in their work. And I would say, I mean, there's a lot more that I wanted to develop here. I would call it a kind of like poetics of reverberation, right? Thinking about Glissant's poetics of relation, where for him, opacity is forged. I mean, opacity forges a kind of relation between people who consent not to know everything about the other across power differentials. And here, I think, it's like the many screens allow for echoes, sonic, visual, narrative, that place one in relation to these constellations of histories. And it is about what reverberations build as something that may come to. A kind of, I think that's what I wanted to say also about kind of multi-sensory witnessing, producing a kind of suprasensory witnessing, that this kind of immersion into sound, image, and text with their frictions, right? I mean, in a way that's almost, although very different formally, that really thinks about the separation of sound and image in a way that's similar to like Godard or modernist cinema of that time. There's a separation between those layers that creates the frictions that make that move, that passageway from the multisensory to the supersensory, I think.
And maybe I can plug in here a question from the audience since it's relevant. I'll take Samir's question first because he just talked about some of the points he mentions. He says, how can we keep these modes of opacity viable beyond their aesthetic potency? Not only what we make invisible, but also how, I mean, here the importance of choosing the apparatuses in which video works, such as those of Abu Rahmi and Abbas, appear both online and offline, museums and festivals, etc.
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I mean, I'm not sure how to answer it exactly. And I think Bاسل and Worwan are in the audience still, and they may have a better sense of their strategies with this. I mean, the different forms of visibility that come through the tricky politics of circulation, of moving between, small spaces and major museums, between English and Arabic, across biennials that have very different funding structures and politics. I mean, I think that these are tactical decisions at every moment. So it's hard to have a kind of overall statement about it. And I think also, this points to the paradox of opacity at large. I mean, when Edward Said says, like the whole history of the Palestinian struggle has to do with being visible, I don't dismiss that. I mean, it's not, like visibility is of course necessary, and it's something to fight for, but not visibility within regimes of recognition that reduce that visibility into forms of identity they're already familiar with and not threatened with. So, yeah, I mean, the works tour widely, and that's super important because we need that kind of radical work to be widely seen. At the same time, I think, that this may be also about forms of installation. I mean, what wall texts can be determined to go around things. How press frames the work as well. Bاسل and Worwan have a major show that's coming up at MoMA in early spring. So, that's as big a show as radical Palestinian artists do. So it's a very interesting question.
And also from anonymous attendee, can you please talk more about the idea of the virtual in Abu Rahmi and Abbas's work, not just as something digital like the avatars of protesters, but within the framework of world building that you so eloquently laid out?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. And here also, I mean, the artists themselves speak brilliantly to what they mean by the virtual. So it's almost hard to speak myself on that. But I think that the virtual, beyond what we understand of it in terms like avatars or virtual reality, et cetera, is about the potential as opposed to the actual. It is about what can be imagined, what we think could be on the basis of our imagination. And it points to, again, a kind of emergence of possibilities. I mean, I think some about potential history, which is a concept emphasized by Ariela Azulay, the cultural theorist and also my dissertation advisor, who writes about potential history as a way of attending to ways of being in the world that are not those that define, say, political concepts like sovereignty, archive, rights, and so on, but are histories that would transform the nature of history as a discipline or the nature of actuality. So I think, again, of the fugitive and the unrecorded here. That is to say that the virtual is not potential necessarily in that it has never happened or something, or never will happen, or that it is imaginary in some sense that discredits its reality. It's virtual in that it exists on a plane that is not visible, but that we can assume has happened because we know, we can imagine it, or we know of similar things happening, if that makes sense to say. So yeah, virtuality generally as a kind of potentiality, I'd say. And for Abbas and Abu Rahmi, I mean, they root the virtual in the actual very directly. And I mean, the same way that I, when I was speaking about archives, wanted to return to archival practices as undertaken by Palestinian artists and scholars. For example, and yet my mask is powerful, which I didn't speak to too much. There's the masking and the virtual subjectivity that's created through the masking, but the video also is about returning to villages that were destroyed and depopulated in the Nakba, about young Palestinians who are doing that in the present. So it emerges from like an actual political practice that's happening right now, and brings it to a level of virtuality, not by like removing its reality in some way, but by multiplying it, by suggesting, for example, its connections to Adrian Rich's poem, which is about diving into a kind of historical reality of patriarchy, or one could read it otherwise, that has been repressed in the so-called Book of Myths that begins her poem. So it's about connecting all these different realities of political practice, and of diving into the wreck at the same time that that connection itself is virtuality.
While we wait for more questions, I maybe want to go back to storytelling again. And in Ilyas Khouri's epic novel, Gates of the Sun, which you take as an example of reparative storytelling, like Khalil, the narrator, a middle-aged nurse, he asks himself in the novel, in one part, do you believe we can construct our country out of these ambiguous stories? Before then, he follows later, he questions the act of construction itself, since stories are inherited. So thinking of constructions, stories, and myth, there's always this notion of return that is directly related to the Palestinian imaginary. And do you think that the Oslo peace, this may sound like a political questions, but not really. Do you think that the Oslo peace process problematized the notion of remaining returnees, as it was put in Ilyas Khouri's novel, as a critical part of fabulation? Or did the post-Oslo returnees problematize that? Here I'm thinking of an interruption in the narrative, in the speculative fabulation of being a returnee. Some people return, some people don't. So how do we look at these discrepancies?
Yeah, I mean, there are many interruptions to the dream of return, I'd say also, though. So yes, there's the selective return, and that certain people who were not allowed to come back once the peace accords are signed, former members of the PLO return, for example. But also, return as a dream just changes a lot. I mean, I'm thinking about the anthropologist Diana Allen's work in Lebanese camps, in Shatila in particular, and how she speaks about, younger generations who don't really have the horizon of return to Palestine per se, though they want it as a right, and they want it as, a form of dignity, is the language that they often use, but are thinking about migration, outside of Lebanon and not back to Palestine. And also the tension between older and younger generations, which Gate of the Sun begins to get at, between, return to the land itself, versus everyday struggles, in a sense, that don't allow for the distant past or future to be the primary imaginary in some way. Of course, that's especially intense in Lebanon, especially now. But when you're thinking about electricity, food, water, and those dominate, that's a bigger interruption to return than the fact that, you know, however many tens of thousands did return in the mid-90s. I'd say, yeah, it's a big question though. I mean, it's a good question to think with.
Yeah, I thought of it because like when putting it in art history context, like for example, like Kemal Bulata famously, like in his book about Palestinian art, in the introduction, he considers place as a major thematic component of Palestinian art history.
Yeah.
And like, obviously the Nakba of 1948 was the point of rupture in both the place and narrative. Like, you know, the destruction of Palestinian society and the establishment of the State of Israel has made it almost impossible to trace even the history of art in Palestine before 1948. How do we fill in the gaps when it comes to stolen history, let's say, or like hidden history, or history that we don't know that even exists? How do we make room for that when it comes to reparative fabulation? And here I'm like underscoring reparative.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, for example, Saidiya Hartman is like, no, we can't fill in those gaps. And her particular position is like, we are in the afterlife of slavery. If I were to fill in those gaps, that's a symbolic repair that comes to stand in for material reparations. And I don't want to have a redemptive story when we haven't had material transformation. And I hear that very loudly when, you know, suggesting any kind of reparative move. And that's why I was saying, you know, I don't think that repair needs to be thought of as making whole. I think it is, you know, it's the return of desires that were lost, that were foreclosed through the trauma of dispossession. You know, in terms of actual recuperation, let's say, whether of particular histories or of documents, books, etc. You know, it's there are two different practices here. I think there's recuperation and there's fabulation. I hope that lots of archivists, historians, whoever, everyday people are doing the work of recuperation. It's not what I personally am working on, so I can't speak to it as much. I mean, like, for example, you know, what you're saying in terms of Bulata's comments on not being able to narrate Palestinian art history in a certain way because of what was lost. I mean, of course, this is true across all of the arts. And for me, maybe I'm most familiar with the cinematic history. And like there we have this example of, it wasn't until the 1970s when, I'm trying to remember which filmmaker, Iraqi filmmaker who was working with the PFLP, Qasim Hawal, went into Shatila and like met a refugee who was working as an engineer there, and started speaking with him, and he realized this was the first Palestinian filmmaker, that he made a film in 1935 recording King Saud's visit to Palestine, 20-minute documentary. And I mean, probably other people knew of him as the first Palestinian filmmaker, but the first, you know, is a thing that exists in official histories. And that's what's different from like potential history or virtuality and like recorded history, positivist historiography, which loves to do the first. And yeah, with Palestine, we can't do the first in any meaningful, authoritative way. So, you know, because this man bumps into another man in a refugee camp in the 1970s, suddenly, as opposed to thinking that the first Palestinian films are really those that are produced under the aegis of the PLO in 1968, you know, Mustafa Abu Ali, Sulafa Jadala, and Hani Jauharieh. It goes back like 3 decades before. And there are also other films that, for example, actually, a lot of this is a great Dara's الفنون resource that, sorry, who was the talk 2018 on Palestinian cinema? He speaks to some of the, he's a character in Azza al-Hassan's film too. I'm just blanking on names right now. But anyway, he talks about how there were actually a number of feature films, he thinks, as well, one by the same director or one by another director, that, so, between 1935 and 1948. So these are things that are still emerging, and I hope that they keep emerging. It's, of course, important to history writing, but I think that's distinct from fabulation, which depends on the idea that we don't know those firsts, we don't know those gaps, and so we imagine them without, suggesting that our imagination itself is sufficient to fill in those gaps, but as this kind of virtuality. Yeah.
Let's see if we have time for more questions. Maybe a question from the audience if someone wants to ask something.
Kaysal Zubaydi is who I was thinking of.
Kaysal Zubaydi, yes.
Yeah.
I'm very tempted to make like a crazy question, like connecting between fabulation and opacity and the politics of invisibility. Like, how do you think of that when it comes, like, should fabulation be like allocated in Moten's notion of the undercommons, and when should it appear or disappear in front of? I'm gonna fail at composing this question, so I'm not sure yet. But here I'm just thinking about fabulation in the undercommons, and by inhibiting that space, that somehow invisible space. When should it appear to the mainstream, if I can use that word actually? When should it appear to the commons? Is there a critical moment? Are there any critical what's the word, like backlashes that can happen? Like, how do you navigate that line between fabulation in the undercommons and like taking your fabulation to the mainstream, to the world, to the commons too?
I mean, I guess I'm hearing this question sort of as what Samira asked a little bit ago too. And so I sort of would respond that it is this tactical choice of where it is effective to present this kind of work. I'm not sure otherwise that I really know what are the stakes of remaining underground versus above in some sense. I mean, the undercommons, right, is about a different kind of sociality and study, and recognizing that is occurring whenever we gather and we talk, and that it's occurring outside those formal spaces of education, of art, and so on. And I think that's important to the conception of fabulation, which recognizes that histories are, ongoing even when not recorded. But yeah, I'm not sure more than that. Yeah.
I think we have a question. All right, there's a question from Laura. Says, thank you for a brilliant presentation, Kareem. I just wanted to put you a little bit in question why you are so committed to witnessing as a practice, even as what you talk about surpasses that so much.
Thank you, Lara. Yeah, that's a question I've thought about a lot. Like, should one just subtract the word witnessing, because witnessing is so tied to testimony and evidence and trauma and victimization and all these different sort of paradigms that I do want to move away from. But yeah, I mean, I hold on to witnessing, first of all, because as I should say, as a critic or as a scholar, like I'm following what the artists and filmmakers themselves give significance to. I don't really want to like theorize or write in such a way that I am not alert to what's actually happening in the work and what the artists say about it. And witnessing is something that the artists and filmmakers that I spoke to themselves speak about. But why I think there is, those of us in the diaspora, or those of us who are watching what is happening in Palestine and Syria and Lebanon and so on, are bearing witness to something that must be stopped, something that must be transformed. And I think that there are different ways of reconfiguring witnessing that we're seeing in all kinds of artistic and political practices. And I believe in those kinds of reconfiguration, but ultimately, I don't think that there is, that there is any kind of possibility of forging solidarities without the act of bearing witness in some form or another. I think we need to expand that, what we mean by witnessing. I think we need to think about it in ways that through opacity, fabulation, these other tactics, change what its impacts can be. But I still hold on to it basically because I think that that's a crucial step in political change.
I just remember the quote by Rancière: to explain something to someone is first to show him or them that they cannot understand it by themselves. So I think we have one more question from an anonymous attendee. Can you speak more to your choice of video and film to explore the idea of world building in your broader project? And to what extent does film lend itself more readily to the question of world building than other artistic forms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm focusing on film and video for the most part, and it is one among many places that, of course, world building can be significant alongside literature, visual art, and gaming, and also just, for better or for worse, it's what like all think tanks and so on are doing. I mean, Kojo Eshun also in his essay Back and Further Considerations on Afrofuturism is like, futurity is the place of R&D departments. I mean, all basically bodies in some way are doing this kind of scenario building as we're increasingly anticipating a dire future that needs to be prepared for globally. But so why for me? I mean, I think that I look at film and video because I think that, montage and the frictions between sound, image, and text that I was speaking about before, allows for a kind of world building that doesn't depend on narrative or conceptual cohesion, but allows for some of the tensions to think through that I think are important. And it's also just a space for the imaginary, again, using that like partly as, what makes a political imagination, and also as like, how do we ourselves dream or imagine? And to me, I think that's in moving images. And, this is not at the exclusion of other things. I mean, I refer to literature and to visual art in my writing, and there are so many great works on world building that attend primarily to other genres. It's not an exclusive thing, but those are some of the reasons that I come into it from film and video. Yeah.
There are no more questions, so I think we
can wrap up. It's been a while.
We can wrap up. Thank you so much, Kareem.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Yazan.
And that'll be it. If you want to follow Kareem's work, you can follow him on Twitter. And I don't know if you want to plug in your social media.
No, I mean, I'm Kareem Estefan everywhere. Google, Twitter, Instagram.
The public part, at least Twitter. So thank you again, Kareem. And thanks, everyone. And hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks.